Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. Today is August 16th, 2024. This is episode 114 of the PetroNerds podcast. I just recorded one a couple days ago, but I am delighted to do this one very quickly right afterward with my guest, Chris Brown from the Common Sense Institute. He's been on the podcast before. So welcome back, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's awesome to be back. Thank you so much, Trisha.
Absolutely. You're just becoming a regular face now, and probably will be a regular face given the work I'm doing with Common Sense Institute. But I want to do this podcast today, and I was kind of pressing Chris to do this on a Friday, largely because the Common Sense Institute just released this report, which I co-authored. This is Colorado's energy competitiveness, and it's a nice like coalescence and bringing together two big things within Common Sense Institute, and that's the new work that they're doing on energy, which I'm a big part of with their new Energy Institute, and they brought me on as Energy Fellow. And then also this ongoing work that Common Sense Institute does on the economic space. And so this is a Energy Competitiveness Index, and Chris can talk to us a little bit more about how the Energy Competitiveness Index fits within the other indices and indexes that you guys do. We're getting nerdy in the econ territory, and I co-authored this report with Stephen Byers, so with the chief economist with Common Sense Institute. So we'll have him on the podcast, maybe all of you guys as well, to nerd out on this. But there's a lot of awesome nerdy detail in this, and so the main kind of topics I want to cover, and I'll timestamp this podcast in a second, but is to me the biggest takeaways and why I really honed in on this was the rise in electricity prices, the rise in natural gas prices, and that correlation with the rise in and really wind and solar power, but it's actually largely wind power in Colorado. I know you have your own kind of notes and outlines and the way you think about it. But Chris, it's so nice to have you back on the podcast. I'm really pumped to talk about this and focus in on this topic. So, I mean, this is going to be energy in Colorado and kind of a lot of the controversy and stuff and rising electricity prices that's happening right now.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you so much. And this is a crucial segment in, as you said, the overall work that we're doing, focus on free enterprise, competitiveness. I think we could fit a few words in, but we often talk about as energy is everything. And when you look at national headlines on inflation, when you look at what households are facing in terms of food prices, I think energy is underlying so many areas, and policy, especially in Colorado, is driving a lot of the changes we're seeing. So I'm excited to dive into this latest report and then sort of continue this evaluation to get the word out, get education out to Coloradans, elected officials and business leaders and voters.
Yeah, and that's really what this podcast is about. So, I mean, I tell people a lot that you can write a paper, but people have to read it. And that's one thing. And we know the nerds that are going to read it, but it's really talking about this and getting it out there. So, for those of you, one, I encourage you to read it. I'll put a link within the show notes, but we're going to dissect this and talk about it and bring it down to a level people can understand. There was a report that also, I don't even know who wrote it. It was something about that came out recently, and it was talking about in the U.S. how electricity prices are not that big a deal because it actually is in line with inflation. And I think that's a bogus BS way from, it's actually conflating data. And it's really, I think it's really sad to the average consumer because it's throwing big economic terms at them and basically telling them that they're stupid and that they shouldn't be concerned about the electricity prices because inflation is right in line with inflation, and it's not. So I'm going to timestamp this with West Texas Intermediate is it's August 16, 2024. It's Friday. We've got what WTI at 76.61. We were going to record this yesterday, and I'll just qualify this that oil prices dropped $2 since yesterday on a lot of different things. So we have volatility there. We got Brent at 79.67. We have Henry Hub at just over $2. That's really, really hurting a lot of folks, especially on the oil and gas side, and something we will talk about today because if you have $2 natural gas, your operators in Colorado are not even getting close to that, and which means the consumers that are paying a crap ton in their natural gas and utility bills, they should be seeing deflation, and they're not. The 10-year yield is at 3.89%. That's correlated really tightly with that 30-year mortgage, which is hanging right at 6.55%. So we won't get into that, but I do think putting a framework for natural gas prices is really important. And the reason I think this is so important to folks in and outside of oil and gas and folks within Colorado and outside Colorado is that Colorado is a leading state for rising electricity prices and rising overall costs. So this competitiveness report, and Chris can give his thoughts and take this is going to be very back and forth. He helped edit it, and there was he did a massive amount of work on it, but I co-authored it. So my biggest takeaway is that the biggest things I want to touch on are the rise in electricity and natural gas prices, and how from an energy competitiveness standpoint, all these indices that go into this index. The rise in electricity prices is one of them. So, what's the cost of electricity prices? What's the reliability of electricity in Colorado? And then clean energy is involved in there as well. So, we actually had a decline in reliability, but we had a rise in prices across the board, whether it's industrial, residential, or commercial. All the prices from 2018 to 2023 rose, and then the same for natural gas prices. They also rose in every category as well. And so, competitively, or comparison to other states, especially regional states like Wyoming, Utah, Colorado is not competitive increasingly. And then actually with the US as well. So that rise in electricity prices, we'll talk about where this electricity is coming from in a minute. But I thought we could, I know you really want to talk about those numbers, and I think those are crucial. But from 2018 to 2023, to have the numbers that are shown in here, that dramatic of a rise is really, really impressive in a bad way, but it's sort of scary, but pretty alarming in terms of how much they went up.
Yeah, I think, yeah, taking a step back and just, I think you've set this up really well. But, a couple of years ago, we launched the Free Enterprise Competitiveness Index. And this has been an annual report for us to examine in aggregate the impacts of policy and actions and how it's impacting Colorado's free enterprise system. I often say, in the work that we do, looking at individual issues, sometimes we miss the forest through the trees. And energy is one of those key areas of this broader competitiveness index. But what it's doing is taking uh, about 10 different variables, looking at the data since from 2011 through the most recent year of data across all 50 states, and looking where Colorado ranks. Frankly, it's looking at where every state ranks, so you can see comparisons and you can see rankings across all 50 states. But what we're trying to do is examine the elements that will impact our state's competitive the most. And as you've mentioned quite a bit, and I think are the top line numbers people care about, is affordability. So we include prices. That it goes to on the consumer side, the industrial side, the commercial side, examining how prices have changed relative to other states over time. And from Colorado's standpoint, we have fallen, and our ranking overall has slipped to 32nd nationally in the most recent report we have. That falls behind some of our neighbors. Wyoming is 7th nationally, Utah is 20th, and then so 32nd ranking 7 spots below the US average. And as you mentioned, that's driven by several of these variables. 6 of the 9 index components actually declining from a peak in 2018. So the ranking has declined, our competitiveness has declined when we look at residential electricity prices, commercial electricity prices, industrial prices, natural gas prices, and a few other areas. So these are the components that impact our state's competitiveness and ability to attract and retain workforce, impact housing affordability, impact business retention, attraction, and we're seeing year over year decline, and something that we're trying to just again put out that can monitor and understand these issues in aggregate.
Yeah, and I will remind listeners to. I mean, so the report is actually it's relatively simple. We clarified a lot of things, so it's worth reading. It's easier to read. It's easy to read, and it's easy. It takes a complex index, and we've simplified it. And I would just note that some of those things. So he said 6 out of the 9, and actually some of the things that actually were good were really not that good. So the clean tech is actually in there, and so this is all relative to other states and relative to the U.S. So if the US is rising, if overall electricity prices in the US are rising, and I've talked about this at length with clients on the podcast, with folks, we do have overall rising electricity prices in the US. And we saw that actually in the CPI data, the inflation data that came out this week. Prices are at 18 cents a kilowatt hour. They're flat month over month, but they've had this dramatic spike up in the last few years. So the reason Colorado in some instances does slightly better is only because the other states have gone that prices have went up higher. And on the clean tech side, I think that's important to realize how much wind and solar is added into the grid. Yes, Colorado has added more, but that corresponds directly with a rise in electricity prices. And I think that was one of the most interesting charts that we have in here is that if you look at wind and solar additions, and actually when you look at the breakout of where power is coming from in Colorado, it's largely wind that's been added. And I think that's very interesting because all the talk of all the sunshine in Colorado, there's a reality that you can't build stuff in Colorado and you can't build stuff actually across the US. So it's interesting that you don't have much more solar. You have a lot of wind. And so you've actually, as you've added this into the grid, this corresponds with data that we see across the board, whether it's in Europe or across the US, is when you add wind and solar into a grid, the costs go up. And so we just, it's a direct correlation and you see that. And there's a number of different factors for this. And within the Common Sense Institute, with work I'll be doing, we are going to expand upon a lot of this, but this is just a first attempt to really unpack this data, harness this and this competitiveness index that Common Sense Institute is doing. But I think I want to get into, talk about, you make the point and clarify it really well. Stuff that I bang home is that energy is not just a sector of the economy. It's the sector of the economy that allows all the whole businesses and commercial and residential and homeowners to actually thrive. And so if Colorado is declining from an energy competitiveness stance, meaning it's declining from ability to the affordability to turn your lights on, whether that's at your home or business, it's really not becoming it's impacting the attractiveness of Colorado as a place to do business and live. And so I think that's really, really critical is that all the policies and legislation, which are becoming increasingly legally bound for Excel and others to reduce their carbon emissions, because these are things brought on by, both on the congressional side, but also from the Pulse administration and then on downward and stuff that's passed through the Senate. These have all, within the index of this report, you can see the massive amount of legislative stuff that's been passed. They're really onerous and they're really burdensome. And so what you're hearing is a lot of folks saying, well, we're doing it. We don't know exactly how we're going to do it. But the reality is that, and something you help point out within the paper is the low hanging fruit, at least on the CO2 emission side, seems to already be taken. It seems to already be achieved from that side. So if we have these aggressive reduction goals in carbon emissions, which is what this seems to be all about from an electricity standpoint, and I heard yesterday a group with climate change talking about the Harris administration plan on economics, which was to continue the Biden administration's plan to electrify the grid, which is kind of funny because it's called electricity. But if those are the plans to continue, you're going down a path that's pretty unsustainable, not just from a cost standpoint, from a reliability standpoint. And in Colorado, that's what has driven all of this, is that we have to so-called green up the grid, add this wind and solar into the grid. And to your point, all these entities are sort of legally bound. And so we're pushing this. And if you look at the CO2 emissions sort of in the back of the report, yeah, it went down a little during COVID, but it's come back up. And really, how much more can be achieved and what's the cost going to be to the consumer and and residential and industrial?
Yeah, I think that's the foundational question. I mean, you hit it on the head, and I think some prior work that we did here at CSI, maybe kind of backtracking for those listeners maybe not as familiar with the Colorado sort of policy landscape, but we had sweeping legislation in 2019 that established these greenhouse gas reduction goals, mandates, if you will, these target dates for how that would then establish how far CO2 emissions were expected to be reduced by 2025 or 2026, 2030, 2040. And they were sort of landmark in that they gave authority to regulatory agencies to promulgate rules now under achieving these targets. So now they can use this criteria in establishing rules aimed at incrementally and bringing down CO2 emissions. We found and have just cataloged that since 2019, there's been more than 55 pieces of legislation, regulatory changes, not like individual rules, but broad rulemakings and legislation under this broad framework impacting virtually every sector of the economy. And over the next couple years, as these issues play out and end up impacting consumers, businesses, households, industrial businesses, manufacturers. We will see sort of the full impact as prices start being passed along. And it doesn't just show up in the energy prices. It's not just impacting the energy
Right.
system. A lot of these regulations are impacting buildings, commercial buildings, that will force changes in terms of their operations that then passes on prices to tenants and to so we're tracking our energy competitiveness, but in some ways, a lot of the policy we're seeing is going to be impacting affordability and competitiveness more broadly.
Absolutely.
And we expect to pick that up in other parts of the index. But this is, I think, a primary focus of a lot of our lawmakers, which has precipitated these recent rules. And what we're hoping is that through these indices and through your work, we're going to continue to pick up on how the changes have been, but then also provide some insights as we look forward into how what impacts we would expect in the years to come.
Yeah, and for me, it's really so it's both exciting and really disheartening that a lot of folks don't know. I mean, electricity is hard to understand. Energy is hard to understand, and so what we're doing now is and I stress this to folks within the oil and gas industry, but also with outside of it, is that the role and importance of natural gas within and coal and the reliability factor of turning your lights on. And so there's trade-offs and costs, and Colorado has absolutely went down a path of very, very aggressive green policy measures to decarbonize everything. And something we've listened to. We've had meetings with stakeholders and just talking to people in the business sector across Colorado, is that people are really concerned about the building side. Right, this is no matter what your business is, you are going to be impacted in Colorado by these aggressive greenhouse gas emission targets. And there's two reports. They're really hard to swallow, but they're the greenhouse gas emission roadmap. There's a 2.0. There's like one that was done on the back of sort of COVID, and then there's been a recent one. And I've been through both of them multiple times. And I have to say they're hard, they're long, but they're also, a lot of these measures for COVID, for CO2 emission reductions, were set on the premise of COVID, which is something that the International Energy Agency and a lot of folks did, and it's really fictitious. And so you actually see that. And I want to bring this back to CO2 emissions a little bit, and then we can get back into this economics and inflation and household and competitiveness for Colorado. But I think it's really important to put this into perspective. And so I kind of forced this into the report. It may not sound like it fits perfectly, but it will be ongoing work, and we will tie this together. But if the point of all of these policy measures is to reduce carbon emissions in Colorado, then you really need to put this in context, because CO2 emissions, one, I personally do not believe this is the most important thing we should be working on. I think there are a lot of other very serious issues. And you actually see that within what the fact that the Harris administration, their economic plan, I think it's ridiculous. But the fact that they're talking about inflation so much and they're concerned about this means that it's really, really concerning, is that household costs really concerning. And so a lot of the measures that on a national and state level have been very, very costly, but they've been on the back of these green policies, on the premise of lowering CO2 emissions. So just to quote this paper, there's 3 charts in this on page 20 that show you total world CO2 emissions, they show you China CO2 emissions, and US. And the US kind of looks flat, but actually when you break those up and you compare, the US has been on the decline and China's been on the rise. And so you're looking at over a third of emissions coming from China, and you're looking at a chunk of that coming from the US. And the US is a large emitter, but a lot of that reduction has come. We've reduced emissions a lot because of natural gas power generation. So if we think about Colorado and we think about all these regulations and everything Colorado is doing, and shutting down all the coal-fired power plants and doing all these things that impact consumers and raising these electricity costs to get green wind and solar into the grid, Colorado, quote, makes up less than 2% of US CO2 emissions and under 0.3%, again, 0.3%, folks, of global CO2 emissions. 1/3, or over 31% of global CO2 emissions, come from China alone, and these emissions are on the rise. So, this is absolutely whack-a-mole with CO2 emissions, and it's really, really important for people who, are aggressively pushing this in Colorado, that 0.3%, less than 0.3% of global CO2 emissions is absolutely nothing. So Colorado can work their ass off and work really, really hard at reducing CO2 emissions and really, really hurt businesses and the ability to make things, the ability to have AI facilities, the ability to do anything in Colorado, and they're not going to impact global CO2 emissions, which that's the whole point. And so that's where this has to be brought into perspective. And I get really, really frustrated that the consumer gets the bill from Excel, and we see that, in the summer months with this hot weather, it's $200. In the winter months, it's around $200, or everybody's had these high bills, and they hear about the rate increases that Excel is going to pass. But if you go to the PUC, or the Public Utilities Commission, it's not clear what you do, how you talk to anyone, how to get information. And so it's really, I think, really sad for the consumer in Colorado that they have no say in, one, understanding where the electricity comes from, and two, how to push back on these rate increases. And this is something I really, really care about in terms of just getting this knowledge out to people and saying, this is where your electricity comes from. These are the prices, and these are the costs of these aggressive policy measures.
Well, you touched on something which is maybe a little bit of uh, uh, a non sequitur, but I think it's very, very related. It's not something we've worked on directly together, and maybe we can explore it here in the coming months. But energy, the market for energy, specifically when we talk electricity, is very different from most markets. We're a free enterprise organization.
Absolutely.
We care about competition, choice, consumer choice. And the energy market, again, specifically when we talk electricity, is largely within a regulated monopoly framework. And don't need to get into all that, but the choice for consumers is limited, and which is why the types of decisions that influence these large investments of the type of energy that is used, type of fuel source that's used to produce electricity, is largely outside of the hands of the individual consumer. So maybe as a separate, question for us to look into the future is how we can really have markets that are more responsive to consumers, that respond to consumers' preference for reliable, cheap, yes, cleaner, and more affordable fuel again is driven by the consumer more so than policy mandates or outside interests.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that's a really, really valid point, and absolutely something that would be kind of nerdy and interesting to explore. But it's also one of those things where I tell people that, it's a so when it comes to oil and natural gas you're regionally stuck largely. I mean, we do export a lot of liquefied natural gas, and so we are impacting global natural gas prices and helping reduce those prices. Not nearly as much as what we could, but regionally, because you have to compress natural gas, because you have to put it in a pipeline, and you can't put it in a truck. It's not as easy to move around as oil or coal. It's regional, and so you have regional prices, and we have more production in the world than anyone else. We're about 125 BCF a day, 126 BCF a day right now. More production, more than double the next largest producer, Russia. And we have the largest oil producer in the world. We're at 13.2, 13.3 million barrels per day. But that's something the consumer actually sees, right? When you have regional natural gas prices, the consumer should see natural gas prices, and they were for a long time until very, very recently. When natural gas prices went up, they felt that. When natural gas prices went down, they felt that. Now, the problem is that on the electricity side, and this is why it's so opaque and I don't like it, is that in Colorado, you're having Excel ask for and pass on rate increases on natural gas to pay for the decommissioning of coal and the expensive renewables that they're adding. So the consumer is not getting. They'll get a spike in natural gas prices, will get a decline, and they're not getting the benefits of, we're seeing $2 an MCF gas. Consumers should absolutely feel a relief in their electricity bill and their utility bill. And I want to clarify to people that when you're getting natural gas on a pipeline direct into your home, it is largely more efficient than if it's going to electricity, and you lose all the you have conversion factors. You lose electricity as it moves, or you lose power as it moves. And so if I'm getting natural gas piped directly into my home, and it's running my furnace or my air conditioning or my stove, that is more efficient in many ways, and often many ways, especially on a furnace side, than it is from an electricity standpoint. So that's huge. But the fact that I'm not seeing lower bills because of that is really serious. And when you counter that and you think of oil's the one thing where people see prices go up and they get very angry with oil companies, but they also see prices go down. And so when prices go up, they see it immediately at the pump, or within a month or two by the time it trickles down from the refiner to the gas station. And then when prices go down, they also see that at the pump. And what's really alarming on electricity is that, and what's fascinating is that it is preventing electricity price rises are preventing the uptick in the adoption of electric vehicles. Something that everybody has been wanting on the green side is the adoption. When you go from 14 cents a kilowatt hour pre-COVID to 18 cents a kilowatt hour now, you are preventing the ability for people to actually want to buy an electric vehicle, which is very expensive. I mean, I think Ford is losing $100,000 on every electric Lightning F-150 that they make. I mean, so they're not just losing on the making side, but then the adoption side. And yeah, I'm sure it's very fun to drive and really exciting, and I've been told it's great. But we're talking about the cost here, and so it's just very fascinating from the when we're talking about where costs get moved and how people understand prices. They see inflation on oil, they see deflation on oil. They're not seeing that on natural gas now. And that's where I think we can come back to the grid a little bit and talk about this. And you're welcome to interject and ask questions. But so we have a chart in here, which I think is super important because I am a petro nerd. Just a nerd in general. Chris actually is a nerd also. So I know he seems really cool, and he is cool, but he's also a nerd, which I think is great. So on page
I'll wear that
21,
badge of honor. Yeah, thank you.
yeah, it is a badge of honor. Absolutely. That's why you've been on the podcast twice now. So on page 21 of the paper, and Chris knows because he's been through the paper a million times with me, it's figure 17. We have a chart that is Colorado electricity production by source. So I think it's super important for people to understand if you're buying a EV and you're plugging it in to know where that electricity is coming from. And that's why, if you're looking at life cycle emissions and if your grid is largely coal and you're plugging an EV in, you're not actually helping on the CO2 emissions front. But if you look at our grid, and this goes to the cost and reliability, which is super important. So we have had coal come down pretty aggressively, along with all trends in the U.S. Coal electricity from coal has come down dramatically, and we went from it's like around 35,000 mega, so it's 35,000 megawatt hours. So this is in 1,000 megawatt hours. So we're 35,000 for coal in 2011, and we come way down in during COVID to the depths. We went all the way down to 20,000. We came back up, and we're just under 25,000, and so we're sort of muted. Now that's really important to realize if you're nerding out on this chart is that coal is still the dominant supplier of electricity in Colorado. The next biggest is wind. And that is a huge shocker. And that actually was kind of shocking to me. It makes a lot of sense with the price side because wind has just continued to escalate. And what's under that is natural gas. And what's so important for people to realize is that when your top three suppliers of energy or from electricity, your sources is coal, wind, and natural gas, and coal is declining, natural gas is not rising, and wind is sort of flat and muted, but it's the second largest. It means that your reliability factor and your intermittency factor is a problem. So one, it makes total sense to me why costs have gone up to the level that they have because you have to pay for these wind additions and the intermittency and the lack of baseload. But the real issue is that when you decline coal the way that they've declined coal and you haven't added natural gas, you no longer have this baseload backup, right? So people don't realize that all this benefits that we've seen in the last 10 years for stable electricity prices and costs for the consumer when we had low inflation across the board for 20, 30 years and really in the last pre-COVID last 10 years, a lot of it was because of this rising energy production in the US, particularly natural gas. And so you had very, very cheap coal and you had natural gas coming to the grid. And so natural gas, you didn't see the price variability and the price spikes as much in natural gas because you could back it up with coal quickly. So as the green policies are being pushed onto states and you're trying to so-called electrify the grid, which it's electricity, so it's a stupid term. But as you're doing this, you are actually taking the price reliability out for the consumer. So now the consumer is you don't have the base load for coal, and so you feel the price spikes for natural gas. And that's so important for people to realize is that that's a price thing, but it can become a reliability thing. And if you actually have, I mean, we have brownouts in California, we have brownouts, we have issues with electricity on either coast because they've gone very, very far on these policies. We haven't had that yet in Colorado, but I think it's a really serious thing to talk about from, I mean, where your energy is coming from, where your electricity is actually sourced from, and the fact that we have reduced reliability and we've had this correlating costs. I mean, it's a direct correlation. As wind has come up, as the wind and solar power in Colorado has come up, so have the prices. So I would love your thoughts. I know that's a little bit that there's a lot there, but I would love your thoughts on that and how you're thinking of that from a sort of your nerdy CSI hat.
Well, as you were talking, I had not heard the electrify the grid remark, but for the record, I fully support electrifying the grid. I think everyone can get behind more electricity for the grid. No, so I think the power source question is one that we probably need to dive into a little bit deeper, specifically as we look regionally. I mean, this data is fantastic. It paints a picture across the state, which I think really highlights the trend that paints the picture on competitiveness we've talked about. But as you know, the underlying investments being made look different across the various
Right.
utilities and providers across the state. And I think if we can dive into this at a sub-state level, we'll be able to get a good picture and a little bit more clarity on how consumers are really being impacted. Again, as we sort of disentangle these regional elements as opposed to smoothing it out at the state level. But the big point you're making and you made about the broader question of the transition, the because of either market conditions, because of subsidy, because of of policy demands, the growth in renewables as part of the underlying fuel source, the intermittency and the cost related to redundancy and backup is essential and something that is kind of masked when you just look at production volumes,
It's beyond
right?
masked.
That the true cost is not really there. And so we can understand and analyze at the moment prices that consumers pay, that end users pay. And we see some evidence there of how these shifts in resources have impacted. We can see the production side, but I think there's a few elements underlying that. The nuance, the nerdy part, but I think is the real critical part for policymakers and for Coloradans and Americans in other states that are facing similar situations to understand it's not just as easy as switching from
Right.
one to the other. Though there are greater costs associated with some of these fuel sources because again of that intermittency and the need for backup. And so that's when I see these charts, they're very informative and they paint compelling, overarching trends, but it just raises more questions that I think requires more investigation.
Absolutely. And I mean, that was the whole point in the whole design, I think, of, well, at least my design with this paper was to like, yes, we need more. I knew what I was doing with this and I knew I'd get people like, and we need more. So, which
Yeah,
is perfect because everybody's sort of looking for these few things. And I'm trying to get the oil and gas industry to, and everyone to realize, the stakeholders and folks to realize how important this is. And it is hard, right? I mean, natural gas guys are not, the background is not playing in the electricity sandbox. And now they have to understand these things. So, but to your point, and I think it's really good, is that I think it's that threshold, and people, there is not good work done on this. So it is not easy for the average person to just find out where the electricity is coming from and what the cost is. Why have they seen rising electricity bills? And that's really muddled. And so that is something I definitely want to continue to work on, of exactly what's causing it. Is it Excel adding the rate increases? Is that coming from the PUC? Is that legally bound, or what exactly is going on? And can the consumer actually push back? I mean, I'm in favor of potentially a ballot initiative. I don't care what it is, but there has to be some clarity for the consumer on what's going on. And I think what's really interesting in one of these charts is it's on page 19, and I'll just show it. What's interesting about this, and you see it across the US, is that I chart in the US wind and solar additions. I strip out wind and solar. I go on the EIA and I take wind and solar and I put it against electricity prices from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And there is a direct correlation. As we've really aggressively ramped up the wind and solar additions into the grid, there's a direct correlation in the corresponding jump in electricity prices in the US, just across the US. And that's supported by the data from JP Morgan, which shows wind and solar penetration in the grid in Europe increases consumer electricity prices. Like, there's a direct correlation. It's interesting in the US that it's barely begun, and it happens so fast under states, and the switch over really from Biden administration to now. Just the timing is that we've seen this aggressive uptake. And I think what's so important to think about that is the threshold, is that you barely started this and you're already seeing a dramatic escalation in price. And so in Colorado, this chart shows the share of electricity from clean energy. And I believe we pulled this out and it's just wind and solar. So that's the clean energy in here. So we went from less than 10, around 14% in 2011, all the way to 36%. And you see this line and it sort of curves, it goes upward and will plateau and then goes back upward. But this nice little clean uptick and swoop comes directly in line from basically 2019 to now, in terms of this uptick in price across a share of the electricity prices in residential, commercial, and industrial correlate directly with the rise in the percentage share that so much of this energy is coming from clean stuff or becoming largely from wind, especially in the Colorado grid. And that's just one. It's pretty alarming because it's the share of which it is in Colorado. So I think you see this. I mean, it's like somebody didn't take a lesson from the UK and Germany. You can see their grids and you can see what the breakout of their grid is and how expensive their electricity prices are. So it just is fascinating because in both of the reports, the those GHG emission reports, the roadmap, GHG emission roadmap 2.0, and all those from the Polis administration. There's a letter from Polis in each of them. And both of them really promise that electricity prices are not going to increase, that they can nearly guarantee that they won't because the stuff is so cheap. So I just, as a consumer and a voter, that it's not factual. So I'm just like that we don't have, this is fiction and yet this is getting forced through. Is there, from your sense, from Comms Institute, the work that you guys do and getting this stuff out, people often ask at this point, well, what can we do? Is it education? I mean, from your standpoint and sitting there, I know we've talked about this a lot, but do you think it's educating the policymakers in Colorado as well as the consumers and bridging this gap on something so hard as energy?
Ultimately, I think yes and yes. I think that has to be the starting point. Is awareness, education, and just a fundamental understanding of the trade offs. I think if you approach any policy with the perspective that this is something we must pursue at any cost, you're going to have these large unintended consequences. And I think some of that has been at the forefront of these debates. A little nuance in that image that you showed and you talked about is the rise in prices following 2018 2019 did follow this significant growth in production from these alternative or fuel energy electricity sources. But in just the last year of data in
Yep.
2023, as there was a slight pullback in the volume in the production volume, prices came down.
Yep.
So they there's a lot of other factors driving prices, undoubtedly, but we can see in an aggregate these trends that raise significant questions, really, as I look forward the next 5 years, because again, those production volumes that we're just talking about, those shares of energy production, electricity production, the expectation is that it goes from 30, 35 to 80 or
Yep.
100
Yep. And
in
we're only
just
at
the
30.
next
Yep. When we're only at
15 years.
36%. We're only at 36%. And so he makes a really good point. So please, guys, check out the chart and nerd out on it because, yeah, there's a corresponding rise. So as prices, as the share of a clean tech, is the share of wind, basically, it is wind for Colorado, but as the share of wind energy goes up within the grid and it goes up to 36%, as it comes down a little bit, the prices come down with it. So there's like a direct correlation. And that's really alarming because, to your point, if it's only 36% and everybody wants 80%, that's insane. We could, there's just no way you're not going to see a rise in electricity costs.
Yeah, and I should just say this. I think it's just it's an important point to make. It just is that as we look at these, I think when you asked your question, sorry, just to clarify, you
No,
asked the
yeah,
question: is it about getting to consumers, policymakers? And I think the real important point is we've sort of confined a lot of the debate into how many, it's all about more renewables for the grid and how do we make that happen. And that seems to be and I think we've confined or constrained the policy debate. I support, and I think when you look at a free enterprise system, you support innovation. You support, there is going to be disruption. There is going to be change, but the way that change is optimized is through, again, competition in the market, through affordability and reliability, providing a better product. And so I think ultimately the better product will win. But I think when you look at the policy environment, is it constraining those alternatives that may in fact be providing a better product in the long run? If we really took a 100-year perspective on what the future of energy would look like, I don't think that today's technology, anyone would argue, is the best that humans can do for the next 100 years. It's going to evolve, but rather than constraining what is possible within the confines of this push on just more renewables in the grid, as opposed to looking at technology outside of that. Um, I think that's just the point that we're at. The challenge that we have is breaking a little bit from this debate, coming to some agreement. Yes, we believe in innovation. Yes, we believe in in innovation in the sector. We don't want to stifle that, but let's understand affordability and reliability on top of these other priorities.
Well, I love that, and I love that you're that summarizing that as affordability and reliability, because I think I want to close on 2 points, and that's taking this the whole point of this, right? Energy competitiveness. So thinking about competitiveness. To me, this is is exceptionally near and dear to my heart because Common Sense Institute is a bipartisan. I don't know if people even. It's very hard to talk bipartisan on anything, especially energy. And I think energy has become
Nonpartisan.
nonpartisan, but I think energy has become very partisan. And so when you look at these states, especially like Colorado, that have, you can't, if the goal is just CO2 emissions and aggressive green policies, and you have to put some clarity and reality to this is that, yeah, you can have that, but you will not be competitive as a state. And we are already seeing that. And we are like, that's why the whole point of this, and I titled this Colorado's Energy Competitiveness and not the Energy Competitiveness Index, because Colorado's energy competitiveness goes directly to the heart of how competitive Colorado is against other states. And we put the data in here. Wyoming is eating our lunch in terms of lower cost electricity. And it is that goes directly to the people, the ability to people to afford homes. I was listening to CNBC yesterday, and they were talking about how one of the underlying hidden costs of home ownership is now increasing the utility bills because they went up so much in the span of a handful of years. And so people think, okay, my mortgage is X with a 6.5% mortgage, but then I've got $200-300 a month for utility bills. And in Wyoming, and I think this is so important. Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico. New Mexico's harder, but let's just say Wyoming and Utah. The importance around this is that if we are aggressively pursuing these policies, we're not doing a damn thing to U.S. CO2 emissions or global CO2 emissions. We're barely a drop in the bucket. We are reducing our competitiveness relative to other states. And so I think that's really, really important actually in comparison to China. So the fact that you've seen Chinese emissions rise, people have to realize that these products, the wind turbines, onshore wind turbines, almost all of them are manufactured in China. The majority of solar panels are manufactured in China, largely exclusively with coal-fired power generation. So that's why their emissions are rising in China. That's why global emissions are rising, and with forced labor. And so there's a reason they can do them for so cheap, and it's for those two input costs, those two components. And so we get them, and people brag about them and say, "Oh my gosh, well, we get these really cheap." And then there's a cost to put them into the grid, and we're seeing those costs, and we've just begun this. So I think it's you have to think about your competitiveness relative to other states and where businesses will move to, and also to China. The cheap goods have been. China's a manufacturing powerhouse. They make T-shirts, they make your cell phones, they make everything, and they make the wind turbines and solar panels. Why aren't those made in America? Because it's really expensive and dirty to do it. And so you just can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't just buy it from China and do this. And so if this is about feeling good, then let's label it as a feel good policy that does nothing on CO2 emissions and increases costs. But it's there's a lot more there. And so I think when we think about the competitiveness, and I just want to put this price out in the key findings, you can see this, but one of the big bullet points is residential electricity prices increased 16.7% on average, so almost 17%, rising to 14.2 cents per kilowatt hour from 12.2 cents per kilowatt hour. So that was from 2018 to 2023. Prices increased nearly 17%. That's a really dramatic uptick in a handful of years, and that's across the U.S. So if you just think about that relative to other states, we're doing these policies initially, but nothing in those greenhouse gas emission roadmaps talks about how we compete with states like Wyoming or Utah. And if you're thinking from a business standpoint, where are you going to do business? You talked about the building stuff earlier. I mean, you're going to do it where you can afford to do it. So I think, as we saw this in the Bitcoin mining stuff, but increasingly we're seeing this on artificial intelligence and data centers, and how those are all powered by natural gas. And it's that reliability factor, I think, access to natural gas and coal. And I know people hate coal, but it's extremely reliable. It's a very, very energy secure form of energy because you don't have to compress it, because you don't have to pipe it, because you can just set it and use it someday. And it's really cheap right now. So I think those reliability and affordability factors are so critical to think about from a competitive standpoint. If Colorado decides to go down this policy road, but Wyoming doesn't, that could be a really big boon to Wyoming to pull in a lot of businesses that can't afford to pay their electricity costs or manufacture things in Colorado. And I think that really just jives against everything that you hear from the Polis administration, others of, we're the center for tech and everything. I don't see how you can be that center. And I don't think how you can bring in businesses when their cost just to power their manufacturer, their warehouse, or even their office is as high as it is and rising.
Yeah. Well, not to bring up a whole nother subject. I mean, the last time we were here discussing this, I mean, we were talking about a paper we did looking at policy uh, through the Colorado legislature that would have banned the permitting of oil and gas
Yes,
production. One of the main things we found was that would have, in fact, increased CO2 emissions as a result of limiting
absolutely.
that permitting the production here and having to import it. Now, I bring that up because I think that is some of the potential irony or challenge of the framework we have of emission reductions at all costs is that I would argue you could actually you could actually increase Colorado's emissions and lower global emissions in the same way that you talked about, either
Yes,
through exports, through
absolutely.
manufacturing, from a CO2 intensity standpoint. Again, it was evident on a production of oil and gas standpoint, probably from a manufacturing standpoint. You could actually see an increase in production domestically, which would increase emissions domestically or in our state, but might have a broader impact and greater impact on global emissions if that again is the objective. So I think that's some of
Absolutely. And that's if you
the
take the
framework.
competitiveness and yes,
No, you're right, and I just think we're limiting ourselves with these policy constraints to look at, okay, we have to do everything we can to reduce the number here in Colorado when in fact we have some of the lowest emission intensity production in terms of oil and gas, in terms of manufacturing, and it just runs counter, I think, to goals. So I think you brought that point up, so I just wanted to kind of elaborate that,
yeah,
and it fits with some of
absolutely.
the prior work and our findings. So a lot more to that.
Yep, and I we can close with that. I think there's a lot more to be done on this work, really illuminating it, really talking to it, really, making it easy to digest and for people to understand this. So expect more. I want to turn these into PowerPoints. I want to walk people through this and understand where energy is coming from in Colorado. And that's something I really want to do with Common Sense Institute. We've talked about energy dashboards and all kinds of things. But I think, in Colorado, that's why it's so critical is that, we produce 5 BCF a day of gas. That's on that's declined from a peak. So access to, and again, gas is regional, and it is regional even locally. So you have to pipe it, you have to compress it, and think about how hard it is to build pipelines, how hard it is to do anything. Clearly it's hard to build solar in Colorado. You have to have this gas, and you have to support the production in Colorado so that you can just maintain the gas within the grid right now, the natural gas within the grid into these homes. So, and your point is it's really, really good about thinking about, and I would say actually CO2 emissions don't probably will not rise. I mean, we've seen a dramatic decline in CO2 emissions in the US. You don't see it in this chart in here, but we'll put it in future ones. When you look at Chinese and US CO2 emissions, I mean, Chinese are up and US has dramatically declined, directly correlated to that natural gas in the grid. So I would argue, if you add more natural gas into the grid in Colorado, in everywhere, and you can keep that backup with coal, and you only use it, you use it when it's needed, and you make your most efficient natural gas side, you're going to continue to lower CO2 emissions. And actually, you're going to bring manufacturing and stuff back to the US and where it's cost competitive because we have this very, very low cost energy. And that will reduce CO2 emissions. Now, there's lots of things of, we can talk about China another time of what that mess is going to be. But it also comes to that point is CO2 emissions the only goal, and should that be the only thing we're thinking about?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of complexity, but I'm eager to disentangle some of these. This is a great starting point. I think this framework, hopefully for people that dive into it, provides some value insights. And again, very much looking forward to continuing our work.
Absolutely. So, Chris, I will put the link to this paper within the show notes. But how can folks reach out to you? I know people can reach out to me on the website at the contact us page at PetroNerds.com, and through that you can ask me about CSI stuff as well. You can also reach out to Chris to reach out to me to talk about this stuff in the context of Common Sense. But where can they reach out to Common Sense Institute and just get more intel and follow this stuff?
Yeah, no, fantastic. My only plug is best way is to go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, put your email in, and you'll get, we don't spam a week, every week or two, give you a newsletter with all of our work. We're about to launch a new website where actually you can just get energy related work if that's what you want to. So stay tuned for a lot of changes coming. But that's the best way just to kind of keep the drumbeat and keep the drumbeat of our work. And then please share it wide, share it far, share with colleagues. If you do have any questions about it, please do reach out, and we'd be happy to get you additional resources as needed.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it, and we will have you back soon, I'm sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Trisha.
Bye, guys.